Welcome to The Explainer. In this series, we break down complex topics into clear, straightforward presentations.
So let's kick things off with a pretty startling question. What if a regional war, one you might see on the news, could actually threaten our entire global food supply in just a few months? According to one leading financial analyst, a conflict in the Middle East is no longer just about oil. No, it's a direct threat to the very systems we all rely on to live.
So in this Explainer, we're going to break down exactly why a conflict centered on one single narrow waterway could, potentially, trigger a global systemic collapse. Okay, so everything really boils down to this one spot, the Strait of Hormuz. You have to think of it as this critical choke point. It's the only way for a huge portion of the world's most vital resources to get from the Persian Gulf out to the rest of us. And when we say choke point, we mean it. At its narrowest point, the strait is just 21 kilometers wide. I mean, think about that. That makes it an incredibly easy target to blockade, basically giving any power along its coast the ability to turn the tap off on global trade.
Now, this is where things get really interesting. Because, most of us, when we hear Strait of Hormuz, we immediately think of oil, right? But the source material we're looking at highlights that the immediate threat actually comes from the disruption of two other, much less obvious resources, plus a very specific type of energy.
The expert we're looking at describes this as a domino effect, where shutting down the strait topples three critical pillars of our modern world, one right after the other. And the first domino, well, it's probably not what you're expecting.
First up, helium. A staggering 30% of the entire world's supply comes from a single gas field in this region. And look, I know you might be thinking about party balloons, but its real importance, it lies right at the heart of the industry that runs our entire digital world.
And this right here perfectly illustrates the chain reaction. It's that simple. No helium means no semiconductors. And without those tiny microchips, you can't make, well, anything electronic. Your phone, your computer, your car, all of it depends on a steady supply of helium.
And that's not just speculation. The expert in our source points to this chilling prediction. Here's the real kicker. You can't really stockpile helium. It's so small it eventually leaks out of any container. So once that supply stops, semiconductor production just stops, dead in its tracks.
All right, so that's the first domino. Now let's move to the next one, which the analyst argues is an even more immediate, more direct threat to human survival itself. And that next domino is fertilizer. Somewhere between 20 and 30% of the entire world's supply has to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. And why? Because it's a byproduct from the very same gas fields that give us all that helium and natural gas.
The analysis in our source presents a pretty brutal reality check here. Modern fertilizer is literally the only reason our planet can feed 8 billion people. Without it, scientists estimate the world's carrying capacity would just plummet to maybe 1 or 2 billion people.
So the conclusion here is, it's pretty much unavoidable, right? If you lose a fifth of the world's fertilizer, you lose a fifth of the world's food. And this wouldn't just be some regional crisis. No, this would trigger a global famine on a scale humanity has never, ever seen. And that brings us to the third and final domino, energy. As the expert shows, global energy use and the global economy are in perfect lockstep. I mean, you can see it right on the chart. When one goes down, the other follows almost exactly. They are completely, totally intertwined. So with a massive chunk of the world's liquefied natural gas, that's LNG, also trapped behind that choke point, the economic fallout would be immediate and absolutely severe. We're not just talking about a recession here, we're talking about a potential global depression.
So you've got to be asking, right? Why would any of this happen? Well, the expert in our source material presents this really complex web of motivations for the key players involved. And they suggest that the public reasons, well, they might not be the whole story.
This table really lays out the analyst's take. On the surface, you hear official reasons like countering nuclear threats or self-defense. But this analysis argues the reality is far more complex. For example, it suggests the U.S. motivation might be less about security and more about oil schemes and ego. For Israel, maybe a long-term desire for regional dominance, and for Iran, a very well-prepared, calculated response to what it sees as foreign aggression. The bottom line is, the public story might be hiding a much deeper, more volatile power play. And based on that complex power play, the source outlines 5 potential, and frankly, terrifying, ways this whole conflict could end. And just look at these outcomes. I mean, they are dire.
They range from the destruction of critical power infrastructure all the way to the use of nuclear weapons. What's really interesting is that the expert believes the most probable outcome is that a well-prepared Iran would try to disable Israel's nuclear capabilities first.
Now, one of the most frightening possibilities mentioned is something called the Samson Doctrine. The name comes from that biblical story of Samson pulling down the pillars of a temple, killing himself along with all of his enemies. In this scenario, if Israel were facing total defeat, it could, allegedly, unleash its entire nuclear arsenal on the world.
And at the end of the day, the analyst's score warning really comes down to this single quote. Our entire interconnected global system has this single point of failure. Whether it's helium or fertilizer or energy, we've built a world that is incredibly efficient but also dangerously, dangerously fragile.
And that leaves us with a really big, provocative final thought. We've just seen how one single choke point can threaten pretty much everything we take for granted. So it forces us to ask, where's the next vulnerability in our global system? And are we prepared for when that next domino starts to fall?